Have you ever wondered why Native Americans slept peacefully on the frozen ground? What exactly did Native Americans do to survive in harsh conditions? What is a night on the Great Plains in mid-January like? Temperatures drop to levels that we would consider extreme today, and the wind chills you to the bone. There are no modern buildings, no central heating, and no down comforters for hundreds of miles around. There is only man and the frozen, icy ground. In our minds, such a night is a sure recipe for death. We, modern people accustomed to comfort, can hardly imagine how one could simply lie down on this frozen ground and fall asleep. However, for the indigenous peoples of North America, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Iroquois, and Cree, it was just another winter night. They did not merely survive in such conditions, they lived and slept in comfort. Watch the video to the end to learn how Native Americans built their beds from two invisible layers, why dry grass was more valuable than fur, and how they managed to capture their own body heat, creating a cozy microclimate in the middle of an icy desert. What if I told you that the main enemy on a freezing night is not the air, but the ground you lie on? This simple truth was the basis of all Native American survival skills. We instinctively fear the cold wind, but it is direct contact with the frozen surface that takes away heat at a catastrophic rate. This process is called thermal conductivity, or conduction. The ground, especially when wet or covered with snow, acts like a giant radiator, drawing heat from any warm object that comes into contact with it. The human body, with its stable internal temperature, is an ideal source of this heat. If you lie directly on snow or ice, your body will be forced to continuously heat the surface beneath it, losing precious energy. Even the warmest furs or blankets will be almost useless if simply laid on the icy ground. Under the weight of the body, the material crumples, losing its main protective function, the air layer. Once the fur is compressed, it becomes as cold as the ground itself. This was the first problem that needed to be solved. For the peoples of the Great Plains or the forest Iroquois, this meant that it was not enough to simply spread a bison skin in a teepee or longhouse. The floor of the dwelling, whether it was packed earth or snow, remained cold. Any bed had to start with the creation of a barrier that would physically separate the sleeper from this bottomless heat absorber. Understanding this principle was not academic, but vital. A mistake in preparing a place to sleep meant not just discomfort, but a serious risk to health and well-being. Every family, every hunter setting out on a journey knew this unwritten rule. The struggle for a comfortable night's sleep began with the struggle against the ground. That is why the entire technology of winter lodging was aimed not so much at covering oneself from above, as at properly insulating oneself from below. This was the first and most important secret. Creating this insulating barrier was a real art, requiring knowledge and careful preparation. Indigenous peoples developed a multi-stage system for this, which we would today call double flooring technology. It was simple to implement, but incredibly effective in its design. This system did not attempt to heat the ground, it simply made it irrelevant to the sleeper. They understood that the cold could be defeated by using its own methods, but reversing them. Instead of allowing the ground to take away the heat, they created a trap that prevented the body from giving it away. This engineering idea, embodied in simple natural materials, is the key to unlocking their comfortable sleep. The entire system consisted of two key layers, each of which performed its own unique function. The first layer was responsible for structure and space creation, while the second was responsible for direct insulation. Without one of them, the system would not have worked to its full potential. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about such a seemingly obvious enemy as the ground beneath your feet? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to learn more secrets of indigenous peoples' survival. Want to know the secret that literally lifted the sleeper above the icy surface? The first step in creating a warm bed was to build a structural base. This was the first floor, and its purpose was to create an air gap between the body and the cold ground. Coniferous tree branches were the ideal material for this. The inhabitants of the eastern forests, such as the Iroquois, or the peoples of the Subarctic, such as the Cree, were masters in the use of spruce or fir branches. They did not simply throw the branches on the ground. There was a whole technology for laying them. The branches were laid in a thick layer, often several tens of centimeters thick, and were laid in a special way, like tiles on a roof. This spring mattress, made of branches, served two important functions. First, it created a resilient, springy surface, which in itself was much more comfortable than sleeping on hard ground. Second, and most importantly, the needles and small twigs created thousands of tiny air pockets. This layer was not intended to be soft in our understanding. Its task was to prevent the next, insulating layer from coming into contact with the ground and being compressed. It served as a frame that carried the weight of a person, preserving the precious air layer beneath it. Even on the Great Plains where there were fewer trees, people looked for ways to create such a foundation. Willow thickets could always be found along rivers and streams. Flexible willow rods or poplar branches could also be used to create this base layer, raising the bed above the ground. The process of gathering pine branches was an important part of preparing for the night. They did not gather old dry branches, but fresh, springy ones. They were more resilient and did not break as quickly under weight. In addition, fresh pine branches exuded a scent that made sleep more pleasant. The thickness of this layer was crucial. For one night in relatively mild conditions, 10-15 centimeters could be enough. But in the harsh winter conditions of the Subarctic, the layer of pine branches could reach half a meter in thickness before anything else was laid on top of it. This method was so effective that it was used not only for sleeping in dwellings. Hunters caught in a blizzard far from camp would first look for spruce or fir trees. Creating such a mattress from pine branches was the first and most important step towards survival in the icy forest. This layer was in essence the equivalent of a modern bed frame or mattress spring block. Its function was to raise the sleeper above the cold floor, but on its own it did not provide complete warmth, as the air in this layer could circulate and cool down. It merely created a platform for the real miracle of insulation that was laid on top of it. How important do you think it was to lay this first layer correctly? In the next chapter, we will reveal the main secret. What exactly turned this springy frame into a real heat trap? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the real Indian bed. If the first layer of branches was the frame, the second layer was the heart of the entire system. Its task was not simply to create an air gap, but to trap the air, to make it immobile. It is immobile, or dead air, that is one of the best heat insulators in the world. Native Americans intuitively understood this principle thousands of years before the advent of modern insulation. They used any available dry and loose material as this second insulating layer. It could be dry grass, dry leaves, moss, or even crushed dry bark. The secret was in the word dry. Wet grass or leaves immediately lost their insulating properties and began to conduct cold. Therefore, collecting and storing this material was an important part of preparing for winter. Tipis and longhouses always had a supply of dry grass, which was guarded like the apple of one's eye. This loose material was poured in abundance over a spring mattress made of branches. The thickness of this layer was also impressive. It filled all the voids between the branches and created a soft, fluffy duvet that contained millions of tiny air pockets. It was this layer that did most of the work of thermal insulation. It prevented body heat from escaping down to the cold frame of branches and the ground. At the same time, it prevented the cold from the ground from rising up. It was a real heat shield, created from the simplest of materials. This principle is used everywhere today. Mineral wool, foam, and the down in our jackets all work on the same principle. They do not heat on their own. They simply retain still air very effectively, and it is this air that preserves our warmth. On the Great Plains, where grass was the main material, women wove thick mats from it. These mats could be easily rolled up and carried with them during migrations. Before going to sleep, such a mat was rolled out on top of a branch floor, serving as a ready-made insulating layer. For the peoples of the Subarctic, who lived in extreme cold, this layer was even more important. They used dry sphagnum moss, which has not only excellent insulating, but also absorbent properties. It could absorb moisture while remaining relatively dry to the touch. This second floor was a unique and unconventional solution. Instead of relying solely on the thickness of the skins, which would still crumple, The Indians created a system that retained its volume and insulating properties even under the weight of a person. It was ingenious. Modern tourists who sleep outdoors in winter use inflatable or polyurethane foam mats. Native Americans essentially created an organic equivalent of such a mat every time they prepared their bed. If you learned something new about the power of a simple dry leaf, don't forget to like this video. Are you ready for the shocking truth about why one bison hide wasn't enough? Only after 2 insulating layers had been created, a structural one made of branches and a thermal one made of grass, was it time for the 3rd layer. This was the bed on which the person actually slept. For the tribes of the Great Plains, there was nothing more valuable than a bison robe. It was a heavy, thick skin with dense fur, ideal for sleeping in the cold. But, as we already understand, without the first 2 layers, even it would not have saved them from the cold coming from the ground. Now, laid on top of a dry grass mattress, it served its true purpose. It prevented body heat from escaping into the cold air of the dwelling. It worked like a blanket that we put on top of the mattress, not under it. Often several skins were used. One, usually older and more worn, served as a sheet. People lay on it. Another, the best and fluffiest, was used to cover them. Thus, a person found themselves in a real cocoon of fur and skins. But bison were not found everywhere. The peoples of the Subarctic and some forest tribes, such as the Cree, created their blankets in a completely different, but no less ingenious way. They wove them from strips of rabbit skins. Such a blanket was incredibly light and warm. The secret of the rabbit blanket was again in the trapped air. The strips of skin were twisted so that the fur stuck out in all directions. When woven, a huge amount of air remained between these fluffy threads. The result was a bedding accessory that was light as a feather and incredibly warm. Deer, moose, and other large animals also provided skins for bedding. It was important to process them correctly. The skin had to remain soft and flexible even in the cold. Women spent dozens of hours tanning the skins, kneading them with fat and bone marrow. These furs and robes were the top layer of the system. They protected against convection, heat loss due to the movement of cold air. They captured the heat radiated by the sleeper's body and reflected it back, creating a comfortable microclimate. The entire system, branches, grass, skins, worked as a single unit. Remove one component, and efficiency would drop dramatically. It was not just a bed, but a complex engineering system, refined over millennia of trial and error. Which of these materials do you think was the warmest? Bison fur or a woven rabbit blanket? In the next chapter, we'll go beyond the bed and see how the dwelling itself helped to preserve that precious warmth. Even the best bed would be ineffective if it had to be used outdoors in the bitter wind. The dwelling was an integral part of the system of comfortable sleep. The design of the Plains teepee or the Iroquois longhouse was as well thought out as the construction of the bed. Contrary to popular belief, a tipi was not simply a cone made of animal skins. It was a complex structure designed to combat the cold and wind. In winter, an earthen mound or snow was piled around the base of the teepee to completely eliminate drafts coming through the floor. But the main secret of the teepee was the inner lining, or ozan. This was a second wall of skins that ran along the inner perimeter of the dwelling, not reaching the very top. It created an air gap between the outer wall, buffeted by the icy wind, and the living space. This gap worked like a chimney. Cold air entering under the edge of the teepee rushed upward between the 2 layers of skins and escaped along with the smoke through the opening at the top. No drafts entered the living space. This also created a constant draft for the fire. The beds in the teepee were located around the perimeter, adjacent to this warm inner lining. In this way, those sleeping were protected from any drafts. The heat from the central fire reflected off the sloping walls and descended, creating a comfortable zone. In the longhouses of the Iroquois in the northeast, a different philosophy prevailed. These were huge communal dwellings where dozens of people lived under one roof. The very structure of logs and thick bark was already a good insulator from the wind. Inside the longhouse, there were 2-tiered bunks along the walls. This is where people slept. They were raised above the cold earthen floor, which already solved part of the problem. In addition, several fires burned along the entire length of the house, providing a tremendous amount of heat. The heat from the fires and from the many people living together made the air in the longhouse relatively warm. The beds on the bunks, arranged according to the same principle, flooring, dry grass, furs, were protected from the cold of the ground and from drafts. In both cases, in the teepee and in the longhouse, the bed was never placed on the bare floor in the center of the dwelling. It was always part of a well-designed living area, raised or insulated, and protected from the direct effects of the outside cold. The dwelling itself was the first and largest layer of the blanket. It created a buffer zone where the winter cold was not so severe, and within this zone, personal sleep technology came into play. What if everything we have been taught about sleeping in the cold is long outdated? Modern ideas about the breathing body and the need to sleep naked in a sleeping bag so that heat is distributed evenly are completely inapplicable to the sleeping systems that have been used for centuries by the indigenous peoples of North America. Their approach was the opposite. People went to bed fully clothed, not because they didn't know any better, but because they understood the nature of cold better than anyone else. For Native Americans, clothing was not just protection from the elements. It was part of a holistic thermal system built around the body. Soft, supple hides, carefully tanned suede, and fur lining created a natural barrier against the cold. But the secret was not in the thickness of the clothing, but in its construction. Everything was sewn so that air remained between the layers. This air, trapped between the body clothing and bedding, became the most effective insulator. The more air pockets there were, the slower the heat escaped. However, there was one key rule. Only go to bed in completely dry clothes. Moisture was the mortal enemy of warmth. The indigenous people knew that if you lay down in clothes damp from snow, sweat, or rain, your body would lose energy in a matter of minutes. The cold did not come from outside. It was born inside when water evaporated from the surface of the skin. Therefore, in every dwelling, whether it was a wigwam, a teepee, or a dugout, spare sets of clothes and moccasins were always dried by the hearth. Before going to bed, a person would always change into dry clothes. This was not just a habit, but a sacred ritual, part of the preparation for sleep, no less important than the shelter or bedding itself. Dry clothes were the first layer of protection closest to the body. Soft fur capes or blankets were placed on top of them, sometimes in several layers. For those who lived in particularly cold regions, double fur coverings were used. Fur inside, fur outside. They not only retained heat, but also allowed the temperature to be regulated. If it became hot, it was possible to uncover oneself or loosen the ties. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail because life depended on it. Moccasins played a special role. They were not taken off at night. Feet always had to stay warm, but the insoles inside the shoes were changed every night. Dry grass, moss, or soft willow were used as insoles. This material absorbed moisture and created a soft, warm layer. In the morning, the grass damp with sweat was thrown away and replaced with fresh grass. In this way, even during long stops in cold weather, the feet remained dry and protected. This simple but ingenious solution prevented frostbite, cracks, and fatigue, because cold feet are the first step to hypothermia of the whole body. The human body is a natural furnace that continuously generates heat. The entire sleeping system of indigenous peoples was built around the idea of preserving this internal heat. The task was not to heat the surrounding space, but to prevent the heat from escaping. Therefore, everything from clothing to bedding was designed for insulation. Thick layers of dry grass, reeds, or coniferous branches were used as mattresses. This layer not only provided softness, but also raised the body above the cold ground, preventing heat from escaping through the soil. Animal skins were laid on top, with the fur facing up for warmth, or facing down if less heat was needed. When a person lay down in their cocoon, this entire multi-layered set, dry clothes, fur covers, a bed of grass and lichen, turned into a closed thermal system. The air between the layers quickly warmed up from the body and remained still. As a result, the sleeper was as if in a warm cloud, where each detail supported the other. Even if the outside temperature dropped below zero, the inside remained soft and warm. Fur hats or hoods were an essential part of sleep. The head is one of the main sources of heat loss, and indigenous peoples knew this well, long before the advent of modern research on thermoregulation. They wore soft hats, hoods, or wrapped their heads in fur scarves. Sometimes fur hoods were part of a single garment, and people actually fell asleep in the same thing they could get up and go outside in without fear of the cold. This eliminated the sharp temperature difference between sleep and wakefulness. Some tribes practiced a special nighttime ritual. Before going to bed, they warmed their beds by the hearth. To do this, they briefly placed stones heated by the fire on the fur bedding. The stones gave off gentle residual heat and helped to warm the air inside the sleeping cocoon more quickly. When the stones cooled down, the body's heat already maintained the balance. This approach to sleep was holistic. It was not just a habit, but a philosophy. A person did not simply lie down on a bed, they became part of their sleeping system. Their clothing was the final inner layer of this multi-layered structure, an extension of their shelter. Everything was interconnected: the body, the air, the fur, the earth, and the fire. The indigenous people knew that even the slightest mistake, a damp shirt, poorly dried moccasins, carelessly laid grass, could cost them a peaceful night or even their lives. That is why preparing for sleep was considered no less important than hunting or building a fire. It was an act of survival that required discipline and an understanding of nature. They did not fight the cold. They used it, adjusting each element to its rhythm. Have you ever thought about how deeply thought out this knowledge was? After all, for them, dry clothes were not just a convenience. They were the line between life and death. In the next chapter, we will learn what distinguished an experienced northern resident from a novice, and why the secret to survival lay not only in technology, but also in respect for the warmth of one's own body. It is often said that Native Americans were simply hardened and did not feel the cold as we do. This is a convenient but fundamentally incorrect explanation that devalues their knowledge and experience. It was not magic, but a combination of technology and adaptation. Physical acclimatization certainly played a role. People who have lived in cold climates for generations have certain physiological adaptations. Their metabolism may be better tuned to generate heat, and their peripheral circulation may be better at conserving it. But this physical adaptation was only a supplement to the main thing: cultural adaptation. The most important thing was knowledge. Knowledge of how to build a dwelling, how to tan a hide, how to prepare a bed from 2 planks, and what clothes to wear to bed. This knowledge was taught from an early age. People did not simply get used to the cold, they knew exactly what to do to avoid feeling it. They did not endure the cold, they conquered it with their intellect and skills. This cultural adaptation was much more important than physical adaptation. Even the strongest and healthiest European settlers quickly perished in the same conditions if they did not adopt local survival methods. They simply did not know what to do. Experience also played a huge role. An experienced hunter could tell at a glance where to find the best dry grass, which branches would make the most resilient flooring, and how to position a shelter relative to the wind. These skills were accumulated over years. So the myth of the superhuman who does not feel the cold should be put aside. We are talking about highly skilled specialists in survival in cold climates. Their comfortable sleep was not the result of insensitivity, but of hard work and a deep understanding of nature. They did not ignore the cold, they respected it. They knew it was a formidable enemy and prepared to face it with all seriousness. Every detail of their daily life was honed to counter this enemy. This system of knowledge was their main toughening. It allowed them to live where modern man without technology would not last even a few days. It was a victory of reason and experience over the elements. They were not superhumans. They were simply people who knew their environment perfectly and knew how to use its resources to their advantage. Their comfort was not a given, but an achievement. If the tribes of the plains and forests were masters of survival, the peoples of the Subarctic, the Cree, Dean, and Athabascans were true professors in this field. They lived in conditions where winter lasts most of the year and temperatures regularly drop to extreme sub-zero levels. Their methods were perfected to absolute perfection. For them, the double flooring technique was not just important, it was the basis of life. The layer of spruce branches that they laid on the floor of their dwellings or on the snow was incredibly thick. It could reach a meter in height, creating a powerful springy frame. On top of this frame, they laid a huge amount of insulating materials. These included not only moss and grass, but also caribou skins. They created not just a bed, but an entire sleeping platform, completely insulated from the icy ground or snow cover. It was in the Subarctic that the art of making blankets from rabbit skins was perfected. It was the ideal material for their climate, incredibly warm and yet almost weightless, which was important for their nomadic lifestyle. In winter, they often built their dwellings directly on the snow. In this case, they used the snow itself as insulation. After trampling down the area, they created their multi-layered flooring directly on top of it. Paradoxically, the deep snow cover itself protected the ground from freezing even more. Temporary hunting shelters were often made directly in the snow. By digging a snow pit and covering it with branches and skins, the hunter obtained shelter. Inside, he built his multi-layered bed using pine branches and furs. These peoples understood that in extreme cold, you cannot skimp on preparing for sleep. It could take a considerable amount of time to create the right bed, but it was an investment in rest and recovery. Their clothing was also the height of perfection. Multi-layered parkas, pants, and boots, mucklucks, made of caribou and seal skins, were tailored to allow freedom of movement and retain heat perfectly. They went to sleep in these clothes, removing only the outer layer. The experience of the peoples of the Subarctic shows that the principles of insulation from the ground are universal. But in harsher conditions, every element of this system, the thickness of the flooring, the quality of insulation, the effectiveness of clothing, must be maximized. Their peaceful sleep on the frozen ground was a direct result of this mastery brought to perfection. They did not simply adapt to the cold, they created a technology that allowed them to live in it in relative comfort. We have looked at bedding and shelter technology, but we have overlooked one important non-technological aspect, the social element. In the harsh conditions of winter, people rarely slept alone. Sleeping together was another important element of the heat conservation system. In the longhouses of the Iroquois, entire families slept on wide bunks. The same was true in the Tipis of the Great Plains. Several people sleeping together under one large bison hide blanket generated much more heat than one person alone. This method significantly reduced heat loss. Instead of each person warming their own sleeping space, several people created a common warm bubble. The surface area through which heat escaped was smaller in relation to the total volume and mass of the bodies. The arrangement of family members in such a shared bed was also well thought out. Adults and stronger family members often lay on the edges, where it was colder. They served as a living shield from drafts and cold for those in the center. This was an effective way to ensure the survival and comfort of all members of the group. Social structure and family ties directly influenced the ability to withstand the cold. Collectivism was part of the survival strategy. The heat generated by several bodies allowed a comfortable temperature to be maintained in the sleeping cocoon, even in very severe frosts. This was especially important when the fire in the dwelling burned out and began to die down in the morning. Sleeping together also strengthened social ties within the family and community. It was a daily act of mutual assistance and care for one another. Survival in a harsh climate was a collective task, and this was evident even in sleep. Thus, a simple but effective biological factor was added to the complex engineering system of branches, grass, and furs. People kept each other warm by combining the heat of their bodies for the common good. The simple physics of sleeping together was known to all peoples living in cold latitudes. It required no materials other than trust and closeness. This proves once again that the comfortable sleep of Native Americans was the result not of a single secret, but of a whole complex of measures: technological, cultural, and social. Let's now put all the pieces together and see how this amazing system worked. The peaceful, deep sleep of Native Americans on frozen ground was not a miracle, and certainly not magic. It was the result of precise knowledge, practice, and observation accumulated over generations. Every element of this system was necessary, and if even one was removed, everything collapsed. To survive in winter, when the ground froze to a depth of human height, it took more than just warmth. It took harmony between people, their dwellings, and their environment. It all started with the most important thing: the dwelling. Its shape and materials were thought out to the smallest detail. The teepee, with its double walls of leather and an inner layer of felt or bark, created the first line of defense. Between these layers was an air gap that acted as a natural insulator. Smoke from the hearth rose upward, and passing between the walls dried them slightly, preventing moisture accumulation. On windy nights, the teepee hummed like a living organism, but inside there was a feeling of security and gentle warmth. The peoples of the forest zone had long houses instead of teepees, massive structures made of logs and bark. Their thick walls retained heat as well as modern insulated stone walls. It was true engineering, dictated by nature. Inside the dwelling, everything was arranged with the same logic. Beds were never placed near the entrance or walls where drafts blew. People slept in the most protected place, closer to the center, where the air was warmer and drier. Often, the bed was raised above the ground using wooden flooring or thick bedding. This was important not only for comfort, but also for thermal insulation. Cold ground is the main thief of heat, and therefore the primary task was to separate the body from the frozen ground. The first layer of the sleeping area could be called a spring mattress. It was made of elastic spruce or pine branches laid crosswise. This layer created a frame that held the rest of the bedding in place. There was enough space between the branches for air to circulate, which provided additional insulation. The branches bent slightly, taking the shape of the body and providing comfort similar to a modern bed. This natural mattress not only kept you warm, but also allowed air to circulate, preventing the lower layers from getting damp. The second layer was the heart of the entire structure, a thick pillow of dry grass, moss, or leaves. This layer served as the main thermal insulation barrier. Millions of tiny air bubbles were trapped in its structure, and air is the best heat retainer. People knew which herbs to use: reeds, marsh moss, dry pine needles. All this was not just collected at random. They chose plants that retained their shape longer and did not absorb moisture. On top, this pillow could be covered with a layer of birch bark or skin to protect it from accidental water droplets or condensation. The third layer was the cover. This is where materials that we would today call high-tech came into play. Bison skins, woven hair blankets, deer robes, all these things had fantastic properties. The fur retained heat, and the leather did not let the wind through. Sometimes the skins were folded with the fur facing outwards so that the heat would return inside, creating a soft microclimate around the sleeper. This blanket did not just cover, it reflected body heat back, forming a stable thermal zone. The fourth layer was personal. This was the clothing in which a person went to bed. It had to be dry, loose, and soft so as not to restrict movement. A thin layer of suede or fur retained heat against the skin, preventing it from escaping. In this case, clothing did not replace the blanket, but worked together with it, enhancing the overall insulation. The indigenous people knew that the human body is a source of heat, and it is not so much a matter of warming up as it is of not losing what it produces. The fifth element was social, sleeping together. On cold nights, families slept together, parents, children, and the elderly. Their bodies created a single thermal cocoon. This way of sleeping not only conserved heat, but also strengthened the sense of community and security. The human body gives off enough heat to warm not only itself, but also its neighbor. In large families, the heat was distributed evenly, and no one was cold. Even small children wrapped in soft skins slept peacefully, feeling their parents' breath nearby. But the most important element of this whole system was knowledge, the sixth invisible layer. It was not just knowledge about things, but a deep understanding of the laws of nature. People knew which materials absorbed moisture, which breathed, and which reflected heat better. They knew how to dry moss, how to lay branches correctly, where to sleep in a teepee so that smoke would not get in and the wind would not be felt. This knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation. The elders taught the young not just how to build a bed, but how to feel it as part of the living world. This system was holistic and self-sufficient. Remove even one element from it, and it would cease to function. Lie directly on a bison skin without a layer of grass, and the cold of the earth would instantly take away all your warmth. Lie on a grass mattress but in damp clothes, and the moisture will begin to draw heat from your body. Every step mattered. They knew that survival did not depend on strength or courage, but on precision and attention to detail. This lost wisdom is still impressive today. Indigenous peoples did not have thermal mats, insulated sleeping bags, or foil tents, but they understood the physics of heat on an intuitive level. They knew how to create comfort using only branches, skins, grass, and air. This was not just knowledge, It was a philosophy of respect for nature. They did not fight the cold, but cooperated with it, turning it into an ally. And perhaps that is why they could sleep on the frozen ground and dream of summer, sheltered not by technology, but by the wisdom of their ancestors. We see that behind the simple fact, the ability to sleep in the cold, lies a complex and ingenious technology. This is not innate hardiness, but the result of deep knowledge in the fields of physics, biology, and engineering, albeit expressed in simple natural materials. Double flooring, the principle of trapped air, proper clothing, and collective warmth were all part of a unified system. This system allowed them not only to survive, but to live a full life in conditions that seem unbearable to us. It is a testament to the incredible adaptability and intelligence of humans, their ability to find elegant solutions to the most complex problems. This is a legacy that deserves not surprise, but deep respect and study. What other aspects of the daily life or technologies of the indigenous peoples of North America would you like to see in our future videos? Perhaps you are interested in their food, hunting methods, or the construction of their summer dwellings? Write your ideas in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research from the world of those who lived in harmony with nature.